Okay, welcome to the last day of ALM Summit 3. So it's day 3, Summit 3, and we have a particular treat for you today. You saw him promoted up to this event as the CTO of Cheeseburger, and he is now, is it CTO at Rover? Chief, pick a title at rover.com, dog sitting, and I didn't even know about these guys. We have a dog, and I should have called him. My poor dog's been, at home for the last few days, but maybe we can work out some service there. Anyway, I want to welcome you to the last day, and Scott, would you like to come on up here and wow us?
Yes, I will wow.
Okay.
Can you all hear me? Good morning. Thank you very much for coming. I don't know, maybe you had to come, maybe your boss made you come. But I just want to start by saying I appreciate that you all did, because it's people who come to events and conferences like this, like people like you, who move our craft and our trade forward, because we're here learning and we're learning from each other. And we're thinking about how to do this stuff better. And there's lots of people who in their work don't think very hard. And I'm just appreciative of everybody who took their time. And well, I wanted to say and add on to that, a lot of that learning comes from talking to each other. So I know this is the last day. This is the sort of third day of the third summit, as he said. But make an effort to meet the people next to you and talk to them and tell them what you're doing and how you can help them and what your biggest problems are, and maybe they can tell you how they can help you, because it's those person-to-person relationships which I think is what really moves our trade and our craft and the work we do forward. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this talk. So the title of this talk was originally Lean Startups, Cheeseburger, and You, because I used to work at a company called Cheeseburger. And I don't know, it seemed like a catchy title. And but then as I was putting it together over the last really 3 weeks I've been working on this thing, it was coming out different. Sometimes you start something and it ends up differently than you expected. So I skipped that. And I did a totally different, well, it isn't totally different. It's just Lean Startups Demystified. Because there's a lot of talk about what the lean startups right now and what this means and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of confusion about it. In fact, it was really hard for me just to put this together. I can boil it down to a sentence, or I can talk about it for like 50 hours. But to get into an hour was challenging. And so I thought that was a good way to angle this presentation, which is like, let's try and cut through that noise and really talk about what this thing is all about. So to do that, the place you have to start is with this word startup. So in your mind, take a moment, imagine what you think a startup is. Okay? Most people imagine an early stage company, 2 people in a garage hacking away, wires coming out of things and explosions and fireworks and lots of grandness and excitement. That's kind of it, but it's not really it. A startup is a word, and it's kind of a crummy word, but it really means a situation you're in of extreme uncertainty, where you don't know a lot about what you're doing, where you don't understand what you're doing, you don't understand how to solve what you're doing, and there's a lot of risk and uncertainty what's going on. The word entrepreneurship, or entrepreneur, which goes with startup, entrepreneurship is the notion of working your way through that startup phase. An entrepreneur is a person who does it. But the fact is, entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs are everywhere. They're in small companies like 2 guys in a garage. They're in big companies like Microsoft. They're within products for a given feature on a certain product that you're trying to work on, where you don't really understand what your customer needs or how to solve that problem if they have it. So entrepreneurship is everywhere. Startups are everywhere. The notion of situations of extreme unknowing, of not really understanding the situation, are all over the place. And when you start to think about it that way, then you can start to say, okay, this notion of lean startup, this set of principles is really what they are, can be applied in a lot of different places, and maybe they can be applied to the problems that I'm having. Sometimes, even if you're just 2 people in a small company, they can be applied to you, and sometimes they're not appropriate, and there's other types of principles and methodologies to look at. So the best way to illustrate this difference is with a little bit of a story. Any MIT alum, any MIT grads in here? Not one? Oh, good. Oh, one. Fantastic. So you might know this name, Alfred P. Sloan. Does anybody know the name Alfred P. Sloan? This guy does. A lot of people do. Alfred P. Sloan was the head of General Motors for about 30 years in the middle of the 20th century. He brought General Motors to prominence, to be, if not the most biggest important American corporation of the 20th century, certainly one of them. And to the point where people said about General Motors, what's good for GM is good for America. He was an MIT-trained engineer, and he's considered sort of the father of the modern American corporation. Things like we take for granted now about big companies like Microsoft or companies where you work, centralized accounting, a lot of the types of financial reporting that we have, the way that corporations and divisions and things like this are organized, he invented all that stuff. He was a master organizer. He was a master administrator, a streamliner, an operator. He was a systematizer, is what he was. Alfred P. Sloan was brilliant at that type of thing. And he was able to take GM from a relatively small company to an enormous company. When he became the head of GM, it actually wasn't that small. It was an $800 million company, which in today's dollars is, I think, about 6 or 7 billion. So it wasn't like it was a small company, but he took it to an enormous company all throughout the 20th century. And as a result, he has things like hospitals and colleges and things like that named after him. This Graduate School of Management at MIT is named after Alfred P. Sloan. So this is a story of two people, though. Actually, I'm going to tell two stories of two people in this talk. This is the first of them. The second guy is a guy named William Durant, Billy Durant. Anybody know that name? One guy back there. All right. So Billy Durant was the guy that founded General Motors. Okay? Billy Durant's an amazing story. He was a high school dropout. He started working in a sawmill, and then he sold cigars. And then he started somehow with a partner making, this is in the late 1800s, making horse-drawn carriages. And with his partner, they built up the biggest horse-drawn carriage company in the world. And like any sort of good business person, he noticed the winds of the times were changing, and horse-drawn carriages were going the way of the buggy whip. Ha-ha. And I didn't get a chuckle from you guys on that one. Tough audience today. And he started to get into automobiles. And he started the General Motors Corporation. At the same time, he had a competitor, Henry Ford, starting the Ford Motor Company. Everybody's heard of that. He had a different approach. Ford said what? He said you could have any color you want as long as it was black. Durant's approach was, I'm going to target different cars at different niches for different people who want something. So he built that, got that going, and after a few years, it was going successfully, but it was not being managed very well, and the board kicked him out, and they brought in somebody else to run it. And so he went off and said, well, shoot, I'm going to go start a company to compete with the Model T, which was becoming pretty big at the time, so he started the Chevrolet Company. And he built up the Chevrolet Company from scratch, and then he sold it back to General Motors. And as he sold it back to General Motors, part of that transaction was he became the head of General Motors again. That was in 1916. And so he's back feeling pretty good at this point, sort of like came back into town and was like, I showed you guys, right? And so he ran it for 4 more years until finally the board kicked him out again and said, look, you don't know how to run a company. Like, you know how to figure out what people want and how to build it from the ground up, but you don't know what to do once this thing is going. And so there was a difference between these two guys. And I found one of my favorite pictures from Cheeseburger to illustrate this difference. Oops. Now that's actually a Chrysler. It's neither a Chevrolet or a General Motors car or a Ford. But the point is, the difference between these two guys is that they had different skills and different skill sets and different managerial styles. They had different abilities. And for different times and situations in the life of a company or a product, you need to have a different way of looking at things. Sloan, as I said, was a manager. He was an optimizer. He was an operator. That was his genius. That's what his genius is recognized at. Whereas Durant, his genius was for this thing that in the lean startup space we call product market fit. It's like hand in glove. Do I have a product and a market that fit together at a price that people will pay for? He had a knack for understanding what people wanted and then going out and having a vision to build that and put it together. He was a genius in his own way. And so there's no value judgment there. There's different strokes for different folks, so to speak. But it's important to understand that different phases of a company, different parts of a product need different approaches. Sometimes they need a Billy Durant, and sometimes they need an Alfred Sloan. And so that's actually a good segue into a little bit of my background. I think Keith mentioned it earlier, which was I spent the last 5 years at a company called Cheeseburger, which I had that slide up here a second ago. I spent my entire career at relatively early stage companies, but they all weren't necessarily startups. So what's interesting about I left Cheeseburger after 5 years at the end of the year because it was time for me to move on. The company was getting more mature, and I joined this company called Rover. Rover is a shameless plug. Rover.com is a marketplace for pet sitting, for dog sitting. So the vision of Rover is to make it a little bit easier to care for your dog. And so if you need to travel or need someone to come during the day, we can help you find that. Well, Rover's kind of a startup in the sense that it's 15 months old and it's small and things like that. It's less of a startup in the sense of the company has found that product market fit. It understands its customers, and it understands the product that they want to solve their problem, which is, I can't find someone to watch my dog. So this company's in a different phase than, say, companies that are either further on or earlier. And so I've spent my whole career doing these kind of early things. I lived in New York City. I worked for a guy named Seth Godin. And then I worked for a little company called Small World Software, which nobody's heard of, but it was some of the first fantasy sports games on the internet. Then I came to Seattle, and I worked for a company called Starwave, which was a Paul Allen company. And we built websites mostly for Disney, and eventually got bought by Disney. And then I went to a company called Drugstore.com. I spent almost 8 or 9 years there, and that was during the dot-com boom. And then left there and went to Cheeseburger, where we started with one little website about cats. If you've ever seen a cat with a caption on the internet, we had something to do with that. And then we grew it to a top 100 web property, and from one site to hundreds and hundreds of sites, to the point now where there's several thousand sites where users can create sites and so on and so forth. And then, like I said, I just joined Rover at the first of the year. So that's a little history of my career, and to set some context for understanding this lean startup principles, it's important for me here. I'm going to do some setup and explain a little bit of my experience with software methodologies through that time. Now, I get that this is sort of like a methodology conference, so like I'm not going to go deep here, okay? And I'm going to just skim it over, and probably some of your senses of your sensibilities are going to be offended by how simple I'm going to talk about some of these things, so just don't take it personally. But so I was cut my teeth on this, on waterfall, right? We've all heard about this. This is how I was taught to do it. And, you know, everyone knows this story, right? Someone gathers the requirements and writes the spec and designs it and hands it off to the developers, and there's testers, and then someone builds it, and then someone releases it, and we had operations people, that whole thing. And this is how I was taught. And the metaphors we would use were building a house. We'd use the metaphors of manufacturing. And that's how originally I was brought up. And this worked okay. It had its challenges, and when it did have its challenges, the way we tried to fix those challenges was focusing on each slice of the pie. So, for instance, we'd say, how can we, if there's bugs, how can we make the testing better? Or if it wasn't what the customer wanted, how can we make the requirement gathering or the speccing better? So we focused on each of those slices. So it's a very stage-based, gated type model. And probably the two important things to understand about this, and the reason I bring it up in the context of lean startup, is the first is that the unit of progress in this system was always, did you hit the milestone, right? Was the spec complete on the right date? Was the code complete when you said it would be complete? Did we complete testing, et cetera, et cetera? So that was the unit of progress, was did we hit the milestone? Did we achieve the gate? And this tends to work really well when you have both a known problem, you understand what the customer needs, and you have a known solution. You know how to fix it, okay? So, because then you can start the beginning and work your way through. And it's interesting, one of my best friends, it turns out to be a home builder, and you know, home building is a very waterfall type process. And I've talked to him a lot about it because I wanted to learn from him. And it turns out that it's like less waterfall than you'd think, which is very frustrating because it's very hard to go undo a house. A lot harder than it is often to go undo software. So I've talked to him about like, well, here's like some agile type principles. Like maybe you could use some of these, but you know, whatever. So, you know, some of it's stuck, but it's hard. It's a hard business. Anyway, point is this is how I learned. And then in like the mid 90s, late 90s to early 2000s, there were some thought leaders who started to say, you know, this isn't working. Those were the agile guys, right? And what they sort of observed was, we don't actually understand how to solve this problem. So we have maybe a known problem, but we don't have a known way of solving it. And so we need a different method for doing this. So they came up with the Agile Manifesto and all these principles in Scrum. And effectively what they introduced in a very simplistic way of putting it there is feedback loops. They started to put feedback loops in the process so that they were continuously calibrating their course. So they had a system which was they designed to be a little bit better for known problems, unknown solutions. They introduced feedback loops to figure out if their solution was in the right path. And their unit of measurement was working software. So at the end of every sprint, or however, or I guess every sprint, did my code work? Could I ship it? And that's that's the innovation they sort of brought to the stage. And so that's sort of a setup to explain a little bit about where Lean Startup starts to fit into this stuff. And I guess that's really it. Their bigger idea was short feedback loops. And so before I go on to talking about Lean Startups for a second, by the way, when I was looking for this slide, you can almost find a Dilbert slide about anything. It's amazing. Okay, so I need to take a sidebar. I'm going to go stand over here for a second. I need to talk about market risk for a second. I need to talk about risk for a second, market versus execution risk. So some concepts to explain. So market versus execution risk. Market risk is the type of risk that you or your company or your feature has that there will be a market for your product or service. Will someone want to buy this? I'm going to build a widget, or I'm going to build a flex capacitor, or whatever you're going to build, and does someone want to have this thing? Will they pay me what it costs? In fact, will they pay me a profit for it? That's what market risk is. Execution risk is kind of the other, well, it isn't exactly the other side of the coin. As you can see, it's a Cartesian graph here, but it's, can I build it? I know they'll buy it, but can I build it? That's what execution risk is. Am I able to execute on this problem? And I've put some examples up here on this chart. Up in the upper left hand, is that upper left? Yeah, upper left, we got a sock puppet there. Now, can people think of maybe a company from perhaps the first .com boom, which had a sock puppet as a mascot, that might have had a high market risk but a low execution risk? I got it. Pets.com. It's not hard to execute on putting dog food in the mail. We could all do it. It's hard to know if there's a market for people who will pay a premium to have dog food mailed to them, right? So Pets.com, and we could all come up with a million examples of situations where there was, do I have this backwards? Yeah, high market risk, and no, I don't have it backwards. High market risk and low execution risk was Pets.com. Let's try and think of something the opposite. Something where you would have low market risk but high execution risk. Anyone? Bueller? Okay. How about a cure for cancer? If you can come up with a cure for cancer, there will be a market for it. It's just a problem is no one can execute on that right now. It's really hard. I bet people will pay almost any amount of money if you can come up with a cure for cancer. You'll make a fortune. And so that's a situation where you've got low market risk, in fact, probably no market risk, and high execution risk. And so this is, I'm going to veer off for a second into a shameless plug. Down in my lower right here where I have the cure for cancer, I've got something called Obliteride. Do we have any cyclists or bike riders in the room? Okay, so my sister-in-law works for the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and she is organizing a bike ride this summer. There's different levels. There's like 25 miles, 50 miles, all the way up to like 200 miles, to raise money for cancer research. It's called the Obliteride, as in they want to obliterate cancer. And so if you're a cyclist, and or a biker, and you want to do something like that, or you just want to volunteer, go check out, after my talk, go check out obliterate.com. And maybe you can help out. Okay, so we understand market risk, and we understand execution risk. And then that brings us to effectively the doorstep of Lean Startup, which is now another story of two other men. The first story was a story of opposition. One guy had one set of skills, the other guy had another set of skills. Now we're going to see a story of sort of synergy, or standing on the shoulders of giants. The first guy is a guy named Steve Blank. Steve Blank was a Silicon Valley guy. He was a serial entrepreneur. He'd been involved in half a dozen companies or so. He had sat on the board or advised many other startups. And Steve's observation was that, these companies aren't going out of business because they can't build the thing that they're promising to build. They're going out of business because they have market risk. All these startups that I'm trying to help, they're building things that nobody wants to buy. And you see that all over the place. You go read TechCrunch or whatever, and you see all sorts of products that people are building successfully, but nobody wants to buy. I'll use a great flame-out example from the last few years. Who remembers this app that came out a few years ago called Color? You remember Color? They raised $43 million before they built anything, and nobody used it because they built something that nobody wanted. So his big observation was that companies or people in this startup situation fail because they're building things that people don't want. And his observation, or his big idea was, you know what? We need to get out of the building and we need to start talking to people. That was his sort of tagline, is get out of the building and talking to people about what they want and what they need in order to start building them the right stuff. We're too focused on how to build it and not enough focused on what they need. And he wrote a book about this called 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And he introduced a concept which he called customer development. That's an important phrase to remember, customer development. Customer development was his methodology. It's like a 25-step process. It's just as complicated as Scrum or whatever, all the arrows going everywhere, for going out and figuring out in a systematic way what the problem was that the customer had and if you could solve it. And I have a summary diagram here of it. This is not the whole thing, but let me walk you through it. It was sort of a 4-step process. The first 2 steps were part of a loop, and then the last 2 steps were not looped. So this notion of customer development starts with customer discovery. You have to identify a segment of customers. You have to discover them. You have to go talk to them and find out what their problem is and perhaps propose a solution and test that solution a little bit. Maybe you build a minimum viable product, or you build some paper prototypes, or whatever you do. And once you've identified some customers, anybody who's ever done a market survey or has ever heard about a market survey knows that people will tell you that they're going to buy a lot more than they really do buy. So then you move to the next phase, which is customer validation. You're actually validating that your customer is real. That when you put this product in front of them, or this service, or this feature, or whatever it is, at a certain price, that they'll actually buy it. And what you're searching for in this phase, if you don't hit stop and go back to the beginning, what you're searching for is a scalable, repeatable business model. A way to convert, in a provable way, to convert your efforts at finding customers into dollars. Right? Once you find that, you might go around doing that a bunch. You might be testing a bunch of sales and marketing. You might have your product and you're testing a bunch of sales and marketing. Because in this customer validation, you're also trying to figure out, how do I reach these people and how do I sell to them? Once you do that, you hop to the next step, which is customer creation. There's a book called Crossing the Chasm. You're effectively crossing the chasm there. And that's when you raise money and you pour money into the company to start scaling. I found how it works. I know if I market here and if I sell to these people, I can grow. So now I'm going to open offices all around the world, and I'm going to scale this company to be huge. And then the last step is when you're actually building this business. This last step is sort of the Alfred Sloan phase. So that was Steve Blank's idea, customer development. And to do these first 2 steps, to understand who wants to buy our product, you have to get out of the building. The answer is not in here. It's out there with the customers. Now, as a practical matter, you can bring customers into the building. You don't actually have to go outside of the building. But the answer is, it's not in our cubes, at our desks. It's not talking to our coworkers, right? We understand our product way more than most people do. It's out talking to customers. Okay, so that's the first guy. The second guy is a guy named Eric Ries. Steve Blank was an investor or a board member or something in a company that Eric worked at. Oh, I forgot to mention this piece. Well, I'll mention it now. So Steve was taking this idea and he was lecturing with it. He had a class, I think, at Stanford, a class at Berkeley, and like an extension type of class, I think. And he invested in this company, this guy Eric Ries, and he said, "Look, if I'm going to invest in you, you've got to come to my class. That's the deal here. Okay, you got to come learn how I want you to do it." So Eric goes to his class, and Eric, he makes his big observation. This is Eric up there. He says, Steve has figured out a system, a methodology here, a systematic way of identifying customers, of addressing that unknown problem space. And Agile, it had this way of addressing this unknown solution space. And if I marry these 2 things together, I have a methodology for addressing the quote-unquote startup space. the space where you have a lot of uncertainty and you don't know what you're doing. Okay? And the result of that, the big idea was, oh my goodness, we've taken what Billy Durant did, being a savant, having a gift of a knack for what the market wanted, what customers wanted, and we've systematized it. So all the knucklehead engineers like us can do it, right? Because it's a very systematic process that you do in a repeatable, scientific type of fashion. Nobody laughed at my knucklehead engineer joke. It's terrible. You guys are not. Let me see if I can think of another joke. Just kidding. So Eric's big idea was like, let's put these things together, and now we have a system for the whole thing, a system that anybody can follow, that we can write down in books and we can teach classes. And the picture of it sort of looked like this. I took this from Eric's website. You got customer development up there at the top, which is feeding you hypotheses, experiments, insights, ideas, down into your way of building software. Agile, this is an XP picture, but an agile method of building software, which then feeds you data and information back to tell you if you're finding a repeatable, scalable business model, right? And by the way, you can apply that agile stuff right down there to marketing too. That's where this movement that's coming up, growth hackers, right? Growth hacking is effectively applying agile, in my point of view, it's applying the feedback loop of agile and the testing loop of agile and of some of this stuff to marketing, online marketing. So this was sort of Eric's big idea. And then he had a few other big ideas too, and I'm going to talk about those in a second. But this is the basics of it. And you can get in. This is why it's so noisy and so hard to understand. It's because every one of those little things up there has got like 5 million blog posts on it, and there's like 50 things up there, right? So that's why it gets so noisy. Okay, so I'm gonna keep on going and boiling it down and getting to a slide that sort of summarizes it in a second here. But I want to take another sidebar. This is a military sidebar about the Air Force and about planes and about a guy, I guess the fifth character in this story, a guy named John Boyd. So as Eric was developing his ideas, he stumbled across this guy named John Boyd, who was a colonel in the U.S. Air Force, I guess in the 60s or so. And he was very instrumental in formulating this idea called the OODA loop. Anyone familiar with this? A few people. Fantastic. So the OODA loop stands for orient, what I got it written down here, observe, orient, decide, and act. And what Boyd put in writing was, this is how pilots, what they do when they're in the air and they're in a dogfight with an enemy combatant, another adversary. This is what they're doing. They observe the situation. They take in all the environmental variables. Then they orient themselves. They combine that information with all the other information they already have. Everything from what the controls on their plane are telling them, to their cultural background, to their belief about the abilities of the other pilots. All their information, they combine that together and orient themselves. That's the second O. Then they decide. Then they decide, what am I going to do about this? What course of action am I going to take? Am I going to fire missiles? Am I going to turn left? Am I going to hit the eject button? What is it going to be? And then they act. They actually do it. And when they act, they then, in turn, change the environment. And so as a result, they need to observe again what happens, and you go through the loop again. And what Boyd figured out was that pilots who could go through this loop faster were more successful and would beat their adversaries. Let me give you a couple of sort of little explanations of this. The first is simply that I think about the story of Wayne Gretzky. Everybody's heard that expression about how Wayne Gretzky says he doesn't skate to where the puck is, or I guess he doesn't skate anymore. He didn't skate to where the puck was. He skated to where it was going to be. You heard that before? Well, this is a case where if you're acting faster than the other pilot is skating to where the puck was, skating to where you were, because you've gone around that loop faster. Another way of thinking about this is, imagine that you and I are both pilots, and I'm a much faster OODA pilot than you, but we're playing chess. And it's like for every time you get to move a piece, I get to move 3. I'm going to win that chess game because I got more moves. And so this is the whole notion of the OODA loop. And Boyd was very revolutionary in terms of the, not revolutionary, but innovative in terms of the military. He got the military to build planes that were smaller and more agile and nimble so that pilots could do this faster, as opposed that were planes that were stronger and more powerful. Because he understood that having a bigger plane wasn't necessarily better. It was the ability to respond more nimbly to the situations in your environment that was more important. So that brings us back to Eric. Make sure I got everything here. Brings us back to Eric. And so Eric observes this, and he's like, huh, if I go back to that big, giant thing I've got there from customer development, I should slide back to it for a second. If I go back to this, the teams that can get through this loop faster are going to win, or at least have a higher probability of winning than the teams that go through it slower. Okay? So that was his sort of second big observation, which was that your runway, meaning the time before you run out of resources, is not time. It's not like I have 6 months until my manager cuts this project or 6 months until we run out of money. It's I have iterations. Can I get through this loop once in 6 months, or twice in 6 months, or 5 times in 6 months? How many chances do I have to figure out what my customers need and if I can solve that problem? And so his second and third big ideas, the first was minimize your time through the loop. Okay? Get through that loop as fast as possible. And this is where we start to hear about a lot of the practices that get associated with lean startups. Things like continuous deployment and things like this, right? Because it's all about minimizing that time through the loop. And the second thing that's important is this notion of the unit of measurement. Going back to why I talked about waterfall and why I talked about agile. Waterfall, unit of measurement, hitting the gates. Agile, unit of measurement, working code. Lean, unit of measurement, validated understanding about what your customers want. If I deploy money in this marketing channel, do I get sales back? If I build this feature, do I get this customer? Et cetera, et cetera. It's all about measuring what you know. Because the whole notion of this startup situation, as I said on that very first slide, is you don't know very much. You don't necessarily know your problem, and you don't necessarily know your solution. So Eric, of course, wrote a book about this too, called The Lean Startup. And he's been on the road, of course, for like the last 5 years, pounding the table on this thing and is getting a lot of adoption for it. And it was really cool because I've gotten to know Eric a little bit personally. I've met him and had meals with him a few times. And he's been like the best voice for articulating what people like myself who've been doing, all I've ever done is consumer web, articulating some of the frustrations and challenges that we've been trying to overcome in the consumer web space, at least. Have had for a long time. And so it was really great to finally have a voice who could articulate this succinctly. And the core of what Eric talks about is this thing called the build, measure, learn loop. You've heard about this. It's not brilliant. This is a summarized version of that bigger one. But this is where it starts to get really, really noisy. What you got here is, okay, you have an idea, you build it, you turn it into code, you measure it, you turn it into data, you learn from it, you think a little bit, you do it again. The key to this, by the way, I've been emphasizing this for a while now. It's the build, measure, learn loop, meaning if you don't do it a second time, there was no point in measuring it, right? There's no point in learning from it. You might as well just code it and ship it. So remember to loop. But then you get into all the details, right? You get unit tests and continuous integration. You get all the stuff from the cloud, and you get just-in-time scalability. You get on the measure, you get split tests, and you get continuous deployment, you get usability tests, and you get, I don't know, predictive monitoring, et cetera. You get all these techniques. And then up here in Learning Faster, you got more split testing, you got customer interviews and root cause analysis and all these things. And this is where it starts to get really confusing. How many things are up there? About, I'd say 30, 35 different things, right? And everybody's got their opinion about how to do it. And when you start to jump into this, it's overwhelming. What should I do first? Should I build faster? Should I make this thing, et cetera, et cetera? These are all just techniques for a story, right? And so let me stop for a second. Hammer time. Stop for a second. I want to summarize where we've been through before we go any further. Okay? Let's take a step back, as I like to say. Startups are situations of extreme uncertainty. You don't know the problem, you maybe don't know the solution. Different skills, different management techniques required for each given situation. Back in the olden times, people thought that was an art. The big ideas from Blank and Reese is, first, the problem is you're building things people don't want, so stop building things people don't want. We put agile and customer development together. We have a structured approach for building things that people do want. Focus on getting through the loop faster. And validated learning is your unit of measurement. That's what startup's all about. Okay, so let me summarize that for you. And this is an important slide. I want everyone to take their phones out and take a picture of this slide. Because if you only learn one thing, if you walk out of this room only knowing one thing, forgetting everything else I told you, just try and forget it for a second. Just remember this. avoid building the stuff that nobody wants, and get through the loop faster. Everything else I've talked about is just commentary on those two things, is how to do those things a little bit better. All those techniques back on the, I'll wait because people are taking pictures, all those techniques back on that slide thing a little while ago with the split tests and all the 35 different things, they're just tactics for doing these two things. This is what Lean Startup is all about. Avoiding building the stuff people don't want and getting through the loop faster because eventually you're going to run out of resources to do it. That's what it's all about, bottom line. So when people are out there saying, oh, we got to do this or that or the other thing or so on and so forth, what they're really saying is we got to do one of these things because we want to build a successful feature, product, business company. And to do it, you do these things. This is how I felt about 4 years ago. I was learning all this stuff. This community was building. There was a great forum online called the Lean Startup Circle where people were talking about this stuff. Eric was first doing his talks. He hadn't written the book yet. He was just blogging. And all of our heads were spinning. But it was invigorating and exciting because it was like, yes, finally something's making sense here. But I was lost and confused and perplexed and disoriented and bewildered and all these different things. I didn't know where to start. I mean, we started doing this stuff, but it was just confusing. And through a series of conversations, I started asking people that question. I said, where do we start? Like, there's an overwhelming amount of stuff to do here. If I go back here, is that the right one? There is an overwhelming amount of stuff to do here. Because, by the way, I have a day job, right? My boss wants me to, like, build features and stuff. And so, like, I'm trying to do all this other stuff, too. Trying to elevate the company, right? And it was overwhelming. Where to start? And so I asked that question, and I sort of came up with 3 answers. The first one is lean is not cheap. If you've ever been in the grocery store and looked at the steaks, the lean steaks are more expensive. Lean does not mean do it on the cheap. Lean means there's no waste in the steak. There's no fat in it. I asked Eric once, I said, why are you calling it lean startups? It seems deceiving. He said, I'm calling it that because I'm trying to create an unwasteful method of getting through this period of uncertainty. That's why he called it lean startup. So when there's a Dilbert, I didn't put it in here, but where the Dilbert comes in and he says, hey, I need 3 more programmers. And the pointy-haired boss says, well, use agile programming methods. And Dilbert says, well, you know, agile doesn't mean that you can just do more work with the same amount of people. And the pointy-haired boss says, well, you know, go away and come back with some words that do mean that. So this is hard. It's expensive. It takes time and energy and commitment to doing it. It's not about just hacking out a little, you know, Google form and throwing it up there. It's about an approach to not being wasteful and trying to figure out what your customers want. That was the first way to get started, is understanding that. The second was actually from another conversation with Eric. This was at South by Southwest about 4 years ago. I said, okay, we've been doing this stuff. We're doing all these things. It's overwhelming, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you think we should start? Eric said to me, well, you start with changing your mindset. You start with thinking about delivering code, as I wrote up here, as an achievement, as opposed to thinking about measurable learning is the achievement, not delivering code is the achievement. For instance, maybe it would be better not to measure velocity on your team, but to measure the number of split tests that you did in a unit of time. Or maybe instead of it stand up and saying, here's what I did today or this week, however frequently you do stand up, it would be better to say, here's what we learned in this period of time. So the first step in his mind was shift the mindset. After you shift the mindset, then you do the customer development stuff. You start talking to customers and doing interviews and things like that. Then you do all the software development methodology stuff, the continuous deployment and things like that. And you know what was really crazy about that answer? Is I totally screwed it up. The team that I had, we were doing it from the top down. We had built this amazing continuous deployment system. We were deploying multiple times a day. We had killer test coverage. We had all this cool stuff. But we were still struggling just to get one A/B test going. It was a battle to get the A/B test going. It was a battle to get customers to come in for an interview. It was work because people were still, in their minds, being evaluated on how much code did I deliver? Because that stuff at the top of the pyramid can help you deliver code faster, and it can make your velocity better. But it doesn't actually help you understand what your customers need more, or if your solution will solve that need necessarily any better if your mindset isn't in the right place. So that was the second place to start. The third place to start came out of a conversation with Dave McClure. Dave McClure is an investor in Silicon Valley. He has a fund, I guess you'd call it, called 500 Startups. He's sort of the Johnny Appleseed of investors. He's like, give everybody a little bit of money and hopefully one of these things will sprout. I asked, and he's very much in this movement, and he has got a thing called Pirate Metrics for Startups, RAAARR. I can't remember exactly what that stands for, but it's an approach to thinking about your marketing. And he's like, look, keep it simple. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, okay? Identify a customer segment, any customer segment, I don't care. Establish a hypothesis about that segment. If I do this or I do that, the segment will do this or that in response. Make a change to either your product or your marketing. Evaluate the response in whatever the appropriate way to do it is, whether it's a split test or interviews, etc. Measure the result, and with that new learning, do it again. Start simple. Don't get overwhelmed by all this stuff. Just start by picking one little customer segment you have. Oh no. Time Machine would like to make a backup. So I don't know if this is going to come back. There it goes. So keep it simple. Don't get overwhelmed by this. Just start by making a change and evaluating the results and doing something based on that change. Coming back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, loop. So just to summarize for everybody, there's a whole lot of techniques people are talking about, a whole lot of software development methodologies, a whole lot of marketing methodologies, customer development methodologies. It really boils down to two things. You're trying to build the stuff people want, and you're trying to get through the learning faster so that you can learn faster if you're building the right thing that they want. That's the basic of what Lean Startup is about. Everything else is just commentary. It's that slide I had you all take the picture of. And so, sort of armed with those first steps and that information, good luck. It's not easy, but there's a lot of resources out there on the web to help. I encourage you to go, all you got to just do is a little bit of searching and go find it. And I'd be happy to take a few questions if anybody has any. Thank you very much.
Do you run mics too? Actually, I've got a mic here, and Aaron has one in the back. Anybody have a question? Over in the corner. Aaron, can you? Hey. There's a little slide in the heel there. Turn it. We are disassembling the microphone. I'll run the other mic up. Just a sec.
There we go. Oh, we got it. So you're learning all this stuff. How do you keep from forgetting what you learned and making sure you don't relearn it?
That's a great question. How do you keep from getting? I don't actually. I've never been asked that question before. The first thought that came to my mind was put it in your software, right? Put that, bake that into your code. The second thing, that's a very good question, and I think one of the costs, getting back to the lean is not cheap point, is doing thorough learning, just like any research endeavor, takes a lot of time and energy to document results. And I don't mean document like in the traditional software development document, but you need to create a shared understanding within your organization of what you learned, and that takes time, right? Somebody in a bigger company, some organizations just have people who are evangelists and go around sharing what they've learned and what they're doing with other organizations. So I don't have any secret answer for that, other than the very first thing that came to my mind was put it in your product as soon as you learn it. All right, well, thank you very much. Well, unless there's somebody else. We've got time, but it doesn't look like anybody's else.
We got to kill 10 minutes. No, actually, we can just take a nice long
We could tell
break.
jokes.
We could. Have you got any
Man walks
funny
into a bar.
pictures to show?
You really want to see some funny pictures? I'll show you my...
That's why they're here.
Okay, time out. I will, give me a second here. I will show you my favorite funny pictures from Cheeseburger.
Okay.
No, that's not going to happen. Let's see here. If I knew that's what you guys wanted, I wouldn't have wasted my time putting together this presentation. Let's see.
You want me to dance and do
it,
shadow puppet
please.
things? So actually, we had a couple questions about the slides. I had a slide up there for the walk-in. We're taking everybody's presentations and putting them on the USB flash drives. Probably about 10, 11 o'clock when we get almost all of the presentations. There's going to be the last one that won't get them to us. So we'll master from that and start making copies of them. And then as you leave, if you head to the airport at noon, hopefully you're actually staying until the end of the day. We really put a lot of good content this afternoon. Then in exchange for that mucked up eval form with the stapled on Thursday page, we'll give you that drive, okay? So we're trying to get as much content on there. The content that doesn't make it on there and any updates are going to go on my SkyDrive, and I will put the link for the SkyDrive on the thumb drive, okay? And I'll put it on the screen later today, and I'll send it in email to everybody who's an attendee. So if you don't get it via one of those three methods, call my cell in the middle of the night, as some of you guys do, and I'll give you the bit.ly link. The number for my cell. Yeah, I'll put that on the SkyDrive.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, so I got a few here. These are from different presentations I've done in the past, so you'll have to forgive me. See, how do I get this to work? Slideshow. Okay, so let's see here.
Oh, and can they get the slides?
Yeah, I'll put the slides up on SlideShare. You can find them on my blog. Okay. So, yeah, this cat's not happy. This next one is just one of my favorites, and some people think it's so cruel, so don't think less of me for putting this one up there. What I love about that is I don't know if the dog is unhappy, like he's sick of being dragged around the yard like a pony, or if he feels bad for the little girl. Now, this one's a little political, but I'm not afraid to show my political stripes. I love that one. All right, and you guys saw this one before. This is one of my favorites. I guess I can skip past. And then I got another deck over here where I had. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. What's that? Oh yeah, that's funny. Oh, so you know this was the first. Oops, how do I get this going back? Slideshow. This was. That's not what I wanted. This is the picture that got I Can't Has Cheeseburger started. Just started floating around the internet, and someone thought that was funny. I'm going to make a website of this. And we have another big site. Or when I was at Cheeseburger, we had another big site still there called Fail Blog, and that's how that all got started. And this is a good one. Now, someone, do we have any like popular music fans in the audience? Any Justin Bieber fans? How about Britney Spears? So here's a good Britney Spears one. I love that one. All right, let me see if I have a good one to finish you off on. Send you home laughing.
I think we're going to have to edit the video before it gets posted.
What's this? Oh, we had this site called Cheeseburger has this site called Picture is Unrelated, and I describe it as pictures that you can explain, or that you can describe but you can't explain. I mean, what's going on there? Why does he have a sewing machine? And what's with that truck?
Why is he smiling?
Why is he smiling? The whole thing is just messed up. Okay, let me see if I can. And then I'll leave you with this last one. Here, I'll just finish off with this. This is kind of funny. This was probably taken somewhere real.
Starbucks up here.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
It was nice to talk to you.